This is a story about a victory that was stolen, and a man who was written out of history. In 1966, Ford achieved the impossible, a 1-2-3 finish at Le Mans, crushing Ferrari. The world saw the drivers, the executives, the famous Carroll Shelby, but they never saw the real architect of that win. His name was Phil Remington, and Ford's greatest triumph was almost undone by a single catastrophic design flaw that only he saw coming. This is the secret war behind the world's most famous race. In the shadow of roaring engines and the glory of Le Mans 1966, one man's genius rewrote racing history, yet his name was almost forgotten. Phil Remington, the quiet craftsman behind Ford's GT40, built victory from sweat, steel, and sleepless nights. While legends like Shelby and Miles took the spotlight, Remington's hands forged the machine that humbled Ferrari and changed motorsport forever. This is his untold story. The war before the race. The story of Ford's legendary 1966 Le Mans victory begins not with the roar of an engine, but with a declaration of war, a corporate duel between America and Europe, between Henry Ford II and Enzo Ferrari. Enter Carroll Shelby, the charismatic Texan tasked with fixing Ford's failing program. And in his shadow, the man Shelby himself called the greatest engineer and fabricator I've ever known, Phil Remington. Remington was a legend from the California hot rod and aviation scenes, a man who could bend metal with his will. He didn't have a fancy degree, he had a welder's torch and an intuitive genius for what worked. His philosophy was brutalist: simplify and add lightness. Quote from Carroll Shelby: "If Remington told you something would work, you could bet your life on it." And we often did. The drivers felt it too. Ken Miles, the brilliant, volatile test driver, formed a sacred bond with Remington. Miles would take a car to the absolute limit, feel it break, and bring the shattered pieces back to Remington. One would find the failure, the other would engineer the fix. This was the crucible where the GT40 was reborn. Yet beneath the headlines and boardroom drama, in the dim-lit garages and echoing workshops of California and Michigan, a quiet genius prepared for battle. Phil Remington. He wasn't a corporate face or a front-page hero. He was the man with calloused hands and an engineer's gaze that could dissect metal like a surgeon studies anatomy. When Ford's dream of buying Ferrari collapsed in a storm of pride and insult, the order went out: build a car that will crush them. The mission landed in the hands of Carroll Shelby and his ragtag band of American builders, racers, and hot rodders. Among them, one name quietly commanded respect: Remington. Phil Remington had seen it all, from hot rods screaming down Southern California boulevards to the early prototypes of speed and endurance that shaped post-war racing. To him, racing wasn't just about horsepower, it was about survival, about keeping a car alive through hellfire conditions that shattered metal and men alike. When Ford's GT program began, the early cars were disasters. Fast, yes, but fragile. The GT40s would scream down the straights of Le Mans, then break their hearts on the next corner. Transmissions failed, brakes melted, engines suffocated. The European elite laughed. The Americans were out of their depth, they said. But Phil Remington wasn't listening. He was observing, quietly, methodically, relentlessly. He didn't see broken parts. He saw opportunity. Every failure was a conversation with the machine. Every burnt brake pad was a message in metal waiting to be decoded. While corporate men fretted over headlines, Remington was buried in the guts of the GT40, stripping, welding, tuning, shaping. He had a sense for the mechanical soul of a car, an instinct for how to make it breathe under pressure. And in that dimly lit workshop, as rain hammered against corrugated steel, he began shaping not just a car, but a revolution. The builders of thunder. By 1965, the GT40 was improving, but not enough. Le Mans was a 24-hour torture test that cared little for dreams. Ford's money couldn't buy reliability. It had to be engineered from sweat and sleepless nights. This is where Phil Remington's genius truly surfaced. He focused not on making the GT40 faster, but smarter. His mind worked like a battlefield strategist, identifying the enemy's weakness and attacking it without mercy. Ferrari's advantage wasn't only speed, it was endurance, pit discipline, and precision. The Italian team could repair and replace with clockwork timing. Ford, on the other hand, was bleeding minutes in every pit stop. Remington saw it like a puzzle. The heavy American engine meant hotter brakes, more wear, and longer pit stops to swap them. So he built a solution that stunned even his own team, the quick-change brake system. In essence, it allowed mechanics to replace worn-out brake pads in seconds instead of minutes, using an ingenious mounting design that locked and released components like the action of a rifle bolt. It was bold, simple, effective, and devastating to Ferrari's chances. The idea came from Remington's years of improvising under pressure. During his time working with airframes and racing teams, he'd learned that victory often came down to who could adapt fastest when things went wrong. When Shelby's crew tested the system, it was clear. This could win Le Mans. Phil's brakes, they called them. Unofficially, of course, because Remington was never one to demand recognition. He didn't talk about credit, he talked about results. But Remington's genius didn't stop there. He refined the GT40's aerodynamics in the wind tunnel, smoothing its blunt nose and stabilizing the tail at terrifying speeds. He reinforced weak joints that snapped under stress. He simplified wiring, lightened panels, and made everything easier to reach, because he knew the real war would be fought not just on the track, but in the pits. Meanwhile, Ken Miles, Shelby's right-hand test driver, pushed the cars harder than anyone dared. Day after day, he drove until parts broke, then drove again. Between him and Remington, a silent understanding grew. One man destroyed, the other rebuilt. Miles would bring back a car on the verge of disintegration, step out covered in sweat and dust, and Remington would already be there with a wrench in hand, ready to make it right. Their partnership became the unseen core of Ford's success. Miles found the flaws, Remington fixed them. Together they forged the GT40 into something terrifying, a brute machine of precision, endurance, and defiance. Still, in the boardrooms above, doubt lingered. The failures of 1964 and 1965 haunted Ford executives. Millions had been spent. The victories were elusive. But Shelby's team, hardened and grimly determined, knew they were close. And Remington, the quiet craftsman, had built the tools that would carry them across the line. As the sun set over Daytona and the GT40s thundered through their final pre-Le Mans tests, sparks flew from the brake pads glowing red-hot. Phil Remington stood by the pit wall, arms crossed, eyes locked on the track. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just watched. And knew, because he had seen it, the transformation of chaos into control, of raw power into balance. The GT40 was no longer just a car. It was an American weapon, crafted in silence, tempered by failure and sharpened by genius. And in the shadows, the man who had made it possible stood ready for war. The road to Le Mans stretched ahead, a gauntlet of speed, fire, and fate. But in that moment, one truth gleamed beneath the hum of engines and the glow of workshop lights. Without Phil Remington, Ford would never even make it to the start line, the secret weapon and the driver's trust. Remington's first masterstroke was the brake system. The existing brakes, designed in the UK, couldn't handle the brutal weight and speed of the American V8. They'd overheat and fade, a terrifying prospect at the end of Le Mans' 200-mile-per-hour straight. So, who designed the revolutionary brake assembly? The concept was championed and radically refined by Phil Remington, working with the team at Shelby American in Los Angeles. He took a crude idea and turned it into a work of mechanical art, the quick-change brake assembly. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a strategic game-changer. While Ferrari's mechanics took minutes to change brakes, Remington's system allowed Shelby's crew to do it in seconds. He built it for the battlefield of the pit lane. But the brakes were nothing without the heart, the engine. The 7.0-liter Ford V8, nicknamed the side oiler for its unique lubrication system, was a beast. But in its early form, it was unreliable. Remington and the mechanics didn't just bolt it in, they massaged it. They reworked oiling systems, improved cooling, and strengthened weak points. The drivers came to adore this engine. Quote from Dan Gurney, "That big Ford V8, it had so much torque. You could short shift it, nurse it, and it would just keep pulling. It was a truck engine that Phil and the boys turned into a thoroughbred." Quote from Ken Miles, as recalled by others, "It's like a sledgehammer. It's not refined, but my God, it's effective. You don't drive it, you point it and unleash it." The mechanics and engineers, in their shop talk, had another name for the refined Remington-touched power plant. They called it the Iron Horse, a testament to its brutal, unbreakable reliability. This was the engine that would power Ford to glory, but only after Remington's hands had touched it. The 24-hour war, Le Mans. To outsiders, it was a race. To Phil Remington, it was a proving ground, a place where metal met mortality, and only the strongest designs survived the night. By 1966, the GT40 program had become more than just Ford's revenge project. It was an obsession. The corporation demanded victory, but the men in the pits, Shelby, Miles, and Remington, knew it would take more than corporate willpower to beat Ferrari. It would take endurance, strategy, and a machine that could outlast hell itself. The paddocks of Le Mans buzzed with tension. European teams eyed the Americans with smug curiosity. Ferrari's scarlet cars sat poised, sleek, and proud. Ford's GT40s, massive and muscular, looked almost brutish in comparison. Loud, heavy, unrefined. But beneath the raw exterior lay Remington's handiwork, a precision-built endurance monster, ready to run 24 hours without mercy. Phil Remington wasn't a man of speeches or spectacle. While others posed for the cameras, he crouched under the GT40, tools clinking softly in rhythm. His hands moved like memory, tightening, adjusting, feeling for imperfections no one else could see. He'd already memorized every bolt, every joint, every point of failure. In his mind, he could take the entire car apart and reassemble it blindfolded. The night before the race, Ken Miles joined him in the pit. The two men stood in silence, listening to the ticking of cooling engines. "You think she'll last?" Miles finally asked. Remington didn't answer. He simply placed a hand on the GT40's fender, as if feeling its pulse. Then he nodded once, not to Miles, but to the machine itself. The green flag falls. June 18th, 1966, the start of Le Mans. As the flag dropped, the thunder of engines shook the French countryside. Ferraris leapt ahead, elegant and composed, while the GT40s bellowed with raw fury, their V8s echoing like cannon fire. But Remington's eyes weren't on the track. They were on the telemetry, the heartbeat of his creation. Lap after lap, the GT40s held strong. The brakes, his brakes, were performing flawlessly. When other cars pitted for long, laborious repairs, the Fords dove in, swapped parts, and roared back out in seconds. The quick-change system was working like magic. By midnight, the battlefield was littered with broken dreams. Cars limped in smoking, gearboxes shredded, engines dying. But Ford's black and gold GT40s kept charging. Each pit stop was a ballet of precision. Remington's mechanics moved with inhuman speed, guided by his meticulous systems and modifications. He had designed everything for simplicity. Bolts positioned for gloved hands, fasteners angled for quick release, components color-coded for nighttime efficiency. Every detail had been thought through, tested, perfected. It wasn't just innovation. It was survival engineering. Ferrari began to falter. Their brakes wore thin. Their engines ran hot. Ford's pit stops were 20, sometimes 30 seconds faster. Over the course of hours, that difference turned into miles. And through it all, Phil Remington stood silent at the edge of the pit lane, the eye of the storm. His expression was unreadable, his focus absolute. Every vibration of the ground told him something about his cars. Every sound, the whine of gears, the pitch of engines, carried meaning. When the sun rose over Le Mans, only the Fords remained unbroken. Ken Miles and the machine. In the cockpit of the #1 GT40, Ken Miles was performing his own kind of symphony. He drove with mechanical empathy, reading the car like a second language. He knew what Remington had built beneath him. He trusted it completely. Hours into the final stretch, the two men were linked by an invisible thread. When Miles reported a vibration through the radio, Remington already had the solution ready before the car even rolled into the pit. A single adjustment, a quick switch, and the GT40 was back on the track, stronger than before. It was as if they shared one mind, the driver who could feel everything and the engineer who could fix anything. As the race neared its end, the scoreboard told an impossible truth. Ford's GT40s were dominating. 1, 2, 3, a sweep. Ferrari had been crushed not by power, but by preparation. The quick-change brakes, the reinforced components, the relentless testing, everything Remington had touched became the backbone of Ford's endurance. But even in triumph, fate had one cruel twist left. Le Mans, 1966. The 24-Hour War. June 18, 1966. The great duel began. For hours, it was a slugging match. The Ferraris were nimble, the Fords were powerful. But as the night wore on, Remington's work began to tell. The quick-change brakes performed flawlessly. Pit stop after pit stop, the Fords gained precious seconds, then minutes. The Ferraris began to crack under the relentless pressure. One by one, their cars succumbed to mechanical failure, the very fate that had once plagued Ford. But then, disaster. In the dead of night, Ken Miles radioed in. A vibration, a shudder. Something was wrong. The corporate engineers panicked. Was it the transmission? The differential? Remington, listening from the pit wall, already knew. He'd heard that sound before in testing. It wasn't a major component. It was a secondary mount, a bracket he had personally reinforced, but one that had fatigued under the extreme punishment. He had foreseen the flaw. He didn't run. He walked calmly to the pit wall, and as Miles's car screeched in, Remington already had the specific wrench and the beefier, hastily fabricated replacement part in his hand. The fix took 90 seconds. The car roared back into the night, healthy. It was the turning point. The unseen victory within the victory. While the world watched the drivers, the real battle was won by a mechanic with a wrench, and then the final, cruel twist. With victory assured, Ford executives, desperate for a PR photo, ordered Ken Miles to slow down, depriving him of a well-deserved solo win. Bruce McLaren's car, having started farther back, was awarded the victory. Miles, the man who had poured his soul into the car, was cheated. Phil Remington, the man who built the winning machine, was ignored. The two most important men in Ford's victory stood in the shadows, watching others spray champagne. As the final hours approached, Ford executives saw an opportunity for a grand gesture, a photo finish. They ordered Ken Miles, leading by Miles, to slow down so the other Ford GT40s could cross the line together. It would be a historic image, a triple victory, a statement of American dominance. Miles obeyed. He slowed. The three GT40s crossed the line side by side. Cameras flashed. Ford's victory was immortalized. But when officials reviewed the results, they noticed something. The other car, Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon's GT40, had started farther back. Despite crossing together, it had technically traveled a greater distance. Miles, who had led nearly the entire race, was denied the win. He stepped out of the car smiling faintly, his exhaustion hiding a quiet heartbreak. Around him, celebration erupted. But in the pits, Phil Remington stood still, expression unreadable. He knew what had been lost. Not just a victory, but recognition for the men who had truly made it possible. The photographers and executives swarmed Shelby, Ford, and the drivers. Remington disappeared into the back of the garage, cleaning his tools, wiping oil from his hands. For him, the glory didn't matter. What mattered was that the car had finished. It had endured. It had proven itself. As fireworks lit the sky over Le Mans, the roar of celebration echoed through the paddocks. But beneath it all, one truth lingered quietly, hidden beneath the champagne and headlines. The real victory had been forged not in the boardroom, but in the grease, sweat, and steel of Phil Remington's hands. He had built the weapon that conquered Ferrari, and yet his name would barely be mentioned in the papers. The legend of Ford's victory had been written, but the man who had engineered it was already fading into the shadows. The forgotten builder. The morning after Le Mans was filled with headlines, but in every story, Phil Remington's name was missing. As executives toasted in Paris hotels, Remington was already back in the workshop, sleeves rolled up, cleaning the soot from the GT40's intakes. The race wasn't over for him, not until every part was examined, every failure understood. That was how he operated, relentlessly forward, never pausing to admire the wreckage of success. He didn't seek fame, but the silence was heavy. The cameras that once hovered over the cars now drifted toward Ford's smiling board members. The victory, like the car itself, had been repackaged into corporate triumph, the face of American industry beating old-world Europe. But under that victory was one man's craftsmanship, precision, and obsession. Shelby knew it. Ken Miles knew it. Every mechanic in the pit knew it. Without Phil Remington, there would have been no finish, let alone a 1, 2, 3. Still, history is written by those who own the photos, the price of perfection. Back in California, Remington returned to Shelby American, where the next project was already on the table. Ford wanted more, faster, lighter, stronger. The GT program evolved into the Mk3, Mk4, and beyond, each demanding new engineering miracles. Remington's approach remained unchanged. Measure, test, modify, repeat. His workshop became a shrine to practical genius. Colleagues would bring him broken parts, and he'd fix them without diagrams, just intuition and feel. He could look at a piece of metal and tell you exactly how it would fail under heat, torque, or pressure. People said Phil didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried the weight of hard-earned truth. Once, when asked how he built such perfect machines, he shrugged and said, "I just make sure nothing can go wrong, and if it does, I make sure it's easy to fix." That line, simple as it sounded, was the essence of endurance racing. He wasn't chasing beauty or speed alone. He was chasing resilience, the kind of mechanical faith that could survive 24 hours of chaos. A quiet revolution. Even after Ford's victories, Remington never slowed down. He helped build the Shelby Daytona Coupe, tuned the Cobra, and later joined Dan Gurney's All-American Racers, where his influence shaped entire generations of racing innovation. If something needed to go faster, last longer, or survive harder, they called Phil. He built Indy cars, airplanes, and even experimental machines NASA studied. Every project carried his fingerprint: precision, simplicity, and quiet perfection. He was the rare engineer who could translate chaos into order, who could see patterns in failure and beauty in the mechanical soul of speed. Yet through all of it, his name stayed in the background, almost deliberately erased by his humility. When journalists came looking for heroes, they found drivers. When sponsors looked for faces, they found executives. Phil Remington stayed in the shadows, not because he was forgotten, but because he preferred it that way. Remington's legacy. So what other cars did this unsung genius work on? Phil Remington's fingerprints are on some of the most iconic machines in history. He was fundamental to the Shelby Daytona Coupe that beat Ferrari in 1965. He engineered the AC Cobra. Later, at Dan Gurney's All-American Racers, he designed and built the Eagle Indy car that won in 1973, and his influence extended to aerospace and beyond. He was the fixer, the man who could solve any problem. He worked until his death in 2013, a king in the workshop, even if he was a ghost in the history books. The rivalry between Ford and Ferrari was dramatic, but the greater, more profound conflict was between the soul of racing, the Remingtons and the Miles, and the business of racing, the executives and the headlines. In 1966, the business won the glory, but the soul won the race. Decades later, the legend of Ford versus Ferrari became Hollywood's myth. Sleek movie posters, star-studded casts, and dramatized rivalries filled the screen. Shelby and Miles became icons. But ask any real mechanic, any racer who knew the truth, and they'll tell you, Phil Remington was the backbone of it all. He wasn't a man of showmanship. He was a man of substance. When Ford's glory faded and Ferrari's empire rebuilt, Remington was still out there, sleeves rolled, grease under his nails, building something better. He worked until the day his hands could no longer hold a wrench. Even in his late 80s, he was in the shop daily, measuring, fabricating, thinking. No university had taught him. No textbook could contain him. He was self-taught, self-made, and self-driven, a true American craftsman from a vanishing era. The quiet farewell. When Phil Remington passed away in 2013, the racing world went silent for a moment, the kind of silence reserved for legends whose names most fans never knew. Teams across the world paused to honor him. Drivers, mechanics, and engineers shared quiet stories. How he once stayed up 3 nights straight to fix a car before a race. How he could design parts with no blueprints. How his solutions looked too simple to be revolutionary, until you realized simplicity was the revolution. In his lifetime, he saw machines evolve from hand-forged metal to carbon fiber composites. He watched computers replace intuition. But through it all, one truth never changed. Races were still won or lost by the people who built the cars. And in that sense, Phil Remington will always remain undefeated. The ghost in the machine. Today, every GT40 replica, every endurance prototype, and every team chasing perfection carries the whisper of his genius. The mindset he forged, relentless innovation, quiet mastery, and human precision, became the unseen heartbeat of modern motorsport. He never craved glory. His triumph was endurance itself. Unanswerable question. So we are left with a haunting question, a what-if that echoes through the annals of motorsport. What if Phil Remington had not been in that garage? What if his quick-change brakes had remained a sketch on a napkin? What if his Iron Horse engine had never been perfected? Ford's money was infinite. Shelby's charisma was undeniable. But without Remington's genius, would it have been enough? Or would the GT40 have remained a beautiful, broken promise? The shocking truth is not just that Phil Remington built the car that won Le Mans. It's that without him, Ford's greatest victory might have been its most expensive failure. What do you think? Could Ford have beaten Ferrari without the quiet man in the shadows? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories. Catch you next time.